The clinking of baccarat crystal and the low velvet hum of million-dollar conversations filled the private dining alcove at Le Bernardin. Cailin Smith, a man whose personal net worth rivaled the GDP of small sovereign nations, had his gold Mont Blanc pen hovering over a contract that would dismantle a billion-dollar energy empire. It was the perfect hostile takeover. The trap was set, the victim seemingly oblivious. But as a young waitress leaned in to pour a measure of 60-year-old Macallan, she didn't offer a polite, rehearsed pleasantry. Instead, keeping her eyes fixed on the glass and barely moving her lips, she whispered 7 words that froze the blood in Cailin's veins. "Your phone is being recorded, Mr. Smith." New York City was drowning in a torrential autumn downpour, but inside the hallowed, sound-dampened walls of Le Bernardin, the atmosphere was perfectly climate-controlled and fragrant with white truffles and toasted brioche. Cailin Smith sat at a corner booth, a position that allowed him a commanding view of the room while keeping his back securely against a dark mahogany partition. At 58, Cailin was a portrait of calculated intimidation. His silver hair was impeccably tailored, much like his charcoal Brioni suit. He had built his fortune in telecommunications logistics before pivoting to ruthless venture capital. He did not make mistakes, he did not leave loose ends, and he certainly did not trust the man sitting across the table from him. Richard Croft was the CEO of Croft Capital, a hedge fund known for its aggressive, borderline legal short-selling tactics. Croft was 10 years younger than Cailin, with a slicked-back undercut and a nervous energy that he tried to mask with loud, boisterous confidence. Tonight, Croft was sweating, though he tried to hide it by dabbing his forehead with a starched white linen napkin. Between them on the table lay a leather-bound dossier. Inside was the death warrant for a company called Helios Tech, a revolutionary solid-state battery startup based in Silicon Valley. Helios had the patents to change the global electric vehicle grid, but they were bleeding cash. Croft had orchestrated a master plan to starve them of their remaining credit lines, forcing them into a fire sale. But Croft didn't have the liquidity to make the final killing blow. For that, he needed Cailin's capital, $4 billion in liquid assets, ready to be deployed at the stroke of a pen. "The beauty of this, Cailin," Croft said, his voice a gravelly whisper, leaning over his untouched plate of yellowfin tuna carpaccio, "is the deniability. We bleed them out through the proxy firms. By the time the SEC even figures out who pulled the strings, we've already stripped the patents, fired the board, and sold the underlying technology to the highest bidder in Shenzhen. It's clean. It's surgical." Cailin took a slow sip of his sparkling water. He studied Croft's face. There was a desperation in the younger man's eyes, a hunger that bordered on reckless. "Nothing is ever truly clean, Richard," Cailin replied, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that commanded immediate silence. "If the SEC traces the proxy firms back to my holding companies in Delaware, it's my neck on the chopping block. You take the finder's fee, and I take the federal indictment." "That's exactly why the indemnity clause is in Section 4, Croft countered quickly, tapping a manicured finger against the heavy paper of the contract. "I take the fiduciary risk. You are merely a passive investor. The legal firewall is impenetrable. I had the boys at Skadden Arps draft it themselves." Cailin remained silent, letting the pregnant pause stretch until Croft shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Silence was Cailin's favorite weapon. It forced the other party to fill the void, usually with concessions or mistakes. As the silence stretched, a waitress approached the table. Cailin noticed her peripherally. Her name tag read Chloe. She didn't look like the typical career servers at Le Bernardin. She lacked the hardened, invisible polish of a seasoned fine dining veteran. She was young, perhaps late 20s, with sharp green eyes and dark hair pulled back into a severe utilitarian bun. But what caught Cailin's attention wasn't her appearance. It was her precise, almost militaristic economy of movement. She moved soundlessly, clearing Croft's appetizer plate without clinking a single piece of silverware. "More water, gentlemen?" Chloe asked, her tone flat, polite, completely unremarkable. "No, just bring the main courses." "And the Macallan," Croft snapped, waving her away dismissively without looking up. Cailin watched her retreat. He prided himself on reading people, and something about Chloe felt entirely out of place. But his attention was quickly pulled back to the leather dossier. The deal was lucrative. Too lucrative. A $4 billion investment would yield a projected $12 billion in 18 months. It was the crown jewel of acquisitions. All he had to do was sign. He reached into his breast pocket and withdrew his Mont Blanc pen, unscrewing the cap. He placed his personal encrypted smartphone face down on the table, right next to Croft's open Italian leather briefcase. "Let's review the indemnity clause one last time, Richard," Kalin said, leaning forward, "because if I find a single loophole that leaves my assets exposed, I won't just walk away from this deal. I will bury Croft Capital so deep the devil himself won't be able to audit your books." Croft swallowed hard, a drop of sweat catching the dim restaurant lighting as it rolled down his temple. "I assure you, Kalin, it's ironclad." The tension at the table was thick enough to cut with a steak knife. Kalin read over Section 4 of the contract, his eyes scanning the dense legalese. He was looking for the trapdoor. In his 30 years of high-stakes corporate warfare, he had learned that there was always a trapdoor. Party A, Smith Holdings, shall be indemnified against all regulatory actions arising from the acquisition of Helios Tech, provided that Party A has no prior knowledge of market manipulation. The wording was standard. Almost too standard. Kalin tapped his pen against the table. His instincts, honed over decades of survival in the blood-soaked waters of high finance, were screaming at him. Why was Croft so eager? Croft was a shark, but a desperate one. His fund had taken massive losses in the European tech sector last quarter. This Helios deal wasn't just a win for Croft, it was a lifeline. "You understand," Kalin said, his voice dropping an octave, "that what we are discussing regarding the proxy firms is textbook market manipulation. If anyone knew we deliberately sabotaged Helios's Series C funding round to crash their valuation—" "No one knows," Croft interrupted, glancing nervously around the room. "That's why we're having this conversation in person, Kalin. No emails, no paper trails, just two gentlemen coming to an understanding." At that moment, Chloe returned. She carried a silver tray bearing two heavy crystal tumblers and a bottle of Macallan 1926. It was a bottle that cost more than most people's homes. She approached Kalin's right side, perfectly positioning herself in the narrow space between his chair and the mahogany partition. "Your scotch, Mr. Smith," she said softly. She placed the coaster down, then the tumbler. As she uncorked the bottle and began the slow amber pour, she leaned in. The restaurant protocol dictated a certain distance, but she breached it by a fraction of an inch. Her face was hovering just beside his ear, obscured from Croft's view by the angle of her body and the tilt of the bottle. That was when she said it. "Your phone is being recorded, Mr. Smith," she murmured, her voice a ghost of a whisper beneath the ambient noise of the dining room. The briefcase lock, the brass dial. Kalin's heart skipped a single violent beat, but his face remained a mask of absolute granite. He didn't flinch, he didn't look at her. He simply took a slow, deep breath, letting the rich scent of the aged scotch fill his lungs. Chloe finished the pour, turned to Croft, served his drink with the same mechanical precision, and walked away without a backward glance. Kalin's mind raced at a terrifying speed. He didn't look immediately at the briefcase. He maintained his steady gaze on Croft, who was eagerly lifting his glass. "To a very profitable partnership," Croft said, raising his tumbler. "To clarity," Kalin replied smoothly, clinking his glass against Croft's. As he brought the glass to his lips, he allowed his eyes to casually drift downward, sweeping over the table. His smartphone lay face down, exactly where he had placed it. 2 inches away sat Croft's open briefcase. It was a beautiful, custom-made Berluti piece. Kalin focused on the brass combination lock facing him. To the naked eye, it was just a polished piece of hardware, but Kalin had spent millions on corporate security. As the soft restaurant lighting hit the brass, he saw it. The center of the 0 digit on the combination dial wasn't solid brass, it was a microscopic dark glass lens. And just beneath it, barely visible through the leather stitching, was a pinhole microphone currently pointed directly at Kalin's phone and his chest. Everything clicked into place with sickening clarity. The desperation, the insistence on meeting in person, the specific wording of the contract, provided that Party A has no prior knowledge of market manipulation. Croft wasn't trying to partner with Kalin, Croft was trying to frame him. If Kalin signed the contract and discussed the illegal manipulation of the proxy firms on tape, Croft would have the ultimate leverage. Croft could use the recording to blackmail Kalin, forcing him to absorb the legal blowback while Croft siphoned the profits. Or worse, Croft had already cut a deal with the SEC, wearing a wire to serve Kalin up on a silver platter in exchange for immunity for his own failing fund. Kalin felt a cold, furious calm wash over him. The predator inside him, the one that had ruthlessly crushed competitors in the late 90s, woke up. He looked at Croft. The younger man was smiling, a greasy, self-satisfied smirk. He thought he had caught the great Kalin Smith. He thought the trap had sprung. He has no idea, Kalin thought, his thumb gently rolling over the gold cap of his pen. He has absolutely no idea who he is dealing with. Kalin slowly placed the Mont Blanc pen back onto the table. It made a soft, definitive click against the wood. "You know, Richard," Kalin began, leaning back in his chair and interlacing his fingers over his stomach. He projected his voice slightly, ensuring the hidden microphone in the briefcase caught every single syllable in crystal-clear high definition. "I've been reviewing this arrangement, and I find myself deeply troubled." Croft's smile faltered. "Troubled? Kalin, we just went over the indemnity." "I'm not talking about the indemnity," Kalin interrupted smoothly, his tone shifting from collaborative to stern, taking on the cadence of a disappointed father or a strict compliance officer. "I'm talking about the rumors I've been hearing regarding your fund's activities." Croft blinked, completely thrown off guard. "Rumors? What rumors?" "The whispers in the market that Croft Capital has been engaging in unethical interference with Helios Tech's Series C funding," Kalin said loudly, enunciating perfectly. "I must state, for the record, right here and now, that Smith Holdings has absolutely zero tolerance for market manipulation. If you or your associates have engaged in any illegal short-selling, proxy sabotage, or violation of SEC Rule 10b-5, I want nothing to do with this transaction." The color drained from Croft's face instantly. He looked like a man who had just stepped out of an airplane only to realize he forgot his parachute. He instinctively reached toward his open briefcase, his hand hovering over it. But he stopped, realizing any sudden movement to shut it off would expose the wire. "Kalin, I don't know what you're talking about," Croft stammered, his voice cracking. "We discussed the strategy, the aggressive posturing." "Aggressive posturing is one thing, Richard," Kalin continued, leaning forward, pressing his advantage. He picked up his smartphone, holding it casually near the briefcase lock, maximizing the audio pickup. "But illegal sabotage is a federal crime. Let me be unequivocally clear. I am only interested in a clean, transparent, and legal acquisition. I was under the impression that Helios Tech was failing purely due to market forces and poor management. Are you sitting here in front of me, admitting that you artificially suppressed their valuation?" "No, God, no, Kalin, keep your voice down," Croft hissed, frantically looking around the dining room. Several patrons at nearby tables had glanced over. "I'm not admitting to anything. You know how these deals work." "I know how legal deals work," Kalin boomed, thoroughly enjoying the sheer panic radiating from the younger man. "This contract you've brought me, Section 4 indemnifies me, yes. But it implies I might have knowledge of prior malfeasance. I do not. Therefore, this contract is entirely unacceptable." With a swift, dramatic motion, Kalin grabbed the contract, ripped it cleanly down the middle, and tossed the pieces onto the table. "Kalin, wait, please," Croft pleaded in a hushed, desperate tone. "We can restructure. We need your capital. If we don't move by Friday, a Japanese conglomerate is going to scoop them up. We lose the patents. We lose billions." Kalin paused. He let Croft stew in his own terror for 10 long seconds. Kalin had successfully poisoned the recording. Any prosecutor listening to this tape would hear Kalin Smith, the upstanding billionaire, explicitly denying involvement in fraud and condemning Croft's alleged actions. Croft's weapon had just been turned into a confession against himself. But Kalin wasn't done. He didn't just want to escape the trap. He wanted the patents. He wanted Helios Tech. And now he had Richard Croft exactly where he wanted him. "I am willing to proceed," Kalin said quietly, his voice now a dangerous low rumble. "But the terms have changed, entirely." "What terms?" Croft asked weakly, his bravado entirely shattered. I will provide the $4 billion, Kalin said, but it will not be an investment into Croft Capital. It will be a direct buyout. Smith Holdings takes 80% equity in Helios Tech. Croft Capital will act solely as a broker. You will take a flat finder's fee of $50 million, and you will sign a sworn affidavit, right here, acknowledging that you acted independently and that Smith Holdings had no part in your prior financial maneuvers. 80%? A flat fee? Croft choked on the words. Kalin, that's robbery. The projected payout is $12 billion. You're cutting me out entirely. I'm keeping you out of federal prison, Richard, Kalin replied coldly, tapping his finger exactly 1 inch from the hidden camera lens in the briefcase. Because if I walk away right now, I make one phone call to the SEC Director of Enforcement. I tell them that Richard Croft just tried to loop me into a massive market manipulation scheme, and I provide them with the exact details of your proxy firms. How long do you think your fund survives that investigation? A week? A day? Croft stared at Kalin, his mouth slightly open, breathing heavily. He was trapped. His own recording device was currently capturing his extortion. If Croft tried to use the tape now, it only proved Kalin's innocence and Croft's desperation. You have until the end of this dinner to draft the new agreement on your laptop, Richard, Kalin said, taking a calm sip of his scotch. It tasted like victory. Or I walk. From the corner of his eye, Kalin saw Chloe standing by the serving station. She was polishing a wine glass. She didn't look over, but Kalin saw the faintest, almost imperceptible smirk touch the corner of her lips. Kalin realized then that he had won the battle against Croft, but a much larger, more dangerous game had just begun. Who exactly was Chloe? And why had she saved him? The glow of the Apple logo on Richard Croft's laptop illuminated the pale, defeated contours of his face. His fingers trembled slightly as they hammered out the keystrokes, drafting a legally binding surrender on a device resting precariously next to his empty appetizer plate. Kalin Smith sat in perfect stillness, savoring the dregs of his Macallan. The ambient hum of Le Bernardin continued unabated around them, billionaires and power brokers oblivious to the brutal corporate execution taking place in the corner booth. Section 4 is rewritten, Croft rasped, his throat entirely dry. He didn't dare reach for his water. Smith Holdings assumes 80% controlling interest. Croft Capital is retained as an independent broker. Flat fee of $50 million. No ongoing royalties, no board seats. And the affidavit regarding your prior maneuvers, Kalin prompted, his voice a soft, unyielding pressure. It's appended, signed via DocuSign. Croft swallowed hard, turning the laptop screen toward Kalin. It's done, Kalin. You have it all. Kalin briefly scanned the document, his sharp eyes catching the digital cryptographic signature that made the contract ironclad. He pulled out his phone, opened his secure encrypted mail client, and verified the receipt of the document to his private servers. Only then did he allow a thin, razor-like smile to touch his lips. A pleasure doing business with you, Richard, Kalin said. He stood up, buttoning his charcoal suit jacket with practiced elegance. He looked down at the younger man, whose career was effectively neutered. I suggest you take that $50 million and quietly retire. If I ever see your firm's name in my sector again, I won't just take your assets. I'll take your liberty. Croft said nothing. He stared at the ruined pieces of the original contract scattered on the tablecloth, his breathing shallow. Kalin turned on his heel and walked out of the restaurant. As he navigated the labyrinth of tables, his eyes scanned the floor for the waitress named Chloe. He checked the serving stations, the sommelier's alcove, even the hallway leading to the kitchens. She was gone. By the time Kalin stepped out into the biting autumn rain of Midtown Manhattan, his security detail was already holding the door to his armored Maybach Pullman. He slid into the plush leather interior, the heavy door sealing him in a soundproof vault of luxury. Drive, Kalin commanded the chauffeur, and connect me to Hayes. A moment later, the deep, gravelly voice of David Hayes filled the cabin via the encrypted speakerphone. Hayes was an ex-MI6 intelligence officer who now served as Kalin's shadow, a man who solved problems before Kalin even knew they existed. Sir, how was the tuna? Hayes asked. The tuna was excellent. The company was toxic, Kalin replied, loosening his tie. I need you to find someone. A waitress at Le Bernardin. Name tag read Chloe. Dark hair, green eyes, roughly 5'7", spoke with an educated, unaccented cadence. She knew about a concealed recording device in Croft's briefcase. There was a brief pause on the line. The sound of rapid typing echoed faintly. Le Bernardin's employee manifests are heavily vetted, Hayes murmured. Give me 90 seconds. Kalin watched the neon lights of Times Square blur past the tinted windows. His mind was dissecting the interaction. Chloe hadn't asked for a bribe. She hadn't slipped him a burner phone or a note. She had delivered high-grade corporate espionage intelligence in a fraction of a second and vanished. Got it, Hayes said, his tone instantly shifting to high alert. Kalin, there is no Chloe on the payroll. The server assigned to your section tonight was a woman named Maria. Maria called in sick at 3:30 this afternoon. Severe food poisoning. A temp agency Le Bernardin uses in emergencies sent over a replacement. The replacement was signed in as Chloe Evans. Let me guess, Kalin said dryly. The temp agency has no record of her either. Exactly. The digital requisition order was spoofed. Someone hacked the restaurant's vendor portal, intercepted Maria's sick leave, and inserted this Chloe directly into your private dining alcove. It's professional work, Kalin. State-sponsored or Tier 1 private intelligence, Kroll, Black Cube, or maybe Pinkerton. Find her, David, Kalin ordered, his eyes narrowing. She saved me from a federal indictment and handed me a $12 billion company for a fraction of the cost. People don't hand out $4 billion in leverage out of the goodness of their hearts. She wants something. I need to know what it is before she comes to collect. I'll run facial recognition against the restaurant's security feeds and cross-reference with known private military and corporate espionage databases. I'll have a name by morning. Make it by midnight, Kalin said, and terminated the call. He leaned back against the headrest. The hostile takeover of Helios Tech was complete. But as he stared into the rainy New York night, Kalin knew the real war had just begun. He had stepped into a trap, and while he had managed to disarm Croft's snare, he was now deeply entangled in someone else's web. The digital dossier arrived on Kalin's secure tablet at exactly 11:42 p.m. He was sitting in the study of his Fifth Avenue penthouse, nursing a glass of sparkling water, the adrenaline of the evening finally settling into a cold, hyper-focused clarity. He opened the file. A photograph stared back at him. It was Chloe, but her hair was down, framing her sharp features in a way that made her look older, more dangerous. Name: Josephine Mercer. Age: 31. Background: former forensic accountant for the SEC, recruited by Black Cube, private intelligence. Went independent 2 years ago. Specializes in corporate sabotage, deep cover infiltration, and data extraction. Kalin scrolled down to the attached financial records Hayes had dug up. Josephine Mercer wasn't a mercenary who worked for the highest bidder. Her client list was blank for the past 8 months. She had funded the Le Bernardin infiltration herself. Why? Kalin murmured to the empty room. He kept reading. At the bottom of the dossier, under known associates and family, Hayes had highlighted a name in red. Father, Thomas Mercer, former CEO of a Midwestern manufacturing firm, Oakhaven Logistics. Oakhaven was the target of a hostile takeover by Croft Capital 4 years ago. The firm was gutted, the pension fund was raided through a legal loophole, and Thomas Mercer was indicted for negligence based on falsified documents planted by Croft's proxies. Thomas Mercer committed suicide 2 months before his trial. Kalin exhaled slowly, the puzzle pieces locked together with a grim, tragic finality. This wasn't corporate espionage, it was a blood feud. Josephine Mercer didn't care about Helios Tech or Kalin's billions. She only cared about destroying Richard Croft, and she had used Kalin as the anvil to smash him against. His phone buzzed, a text message from an unknown encrypted number. Brooklyn Bridge Park. Pier 1. Tomorrow, 6 a.m. Come alone, Mr. Smith. Kalin didn't reply. He didn't need to. The next morning, the air over the East River was freezing, a thick fog rolling off the water and obscuring the lower Manhattan skyline. Kalin stood near the edge of the pier, his cashmere overcoat pulled tight against the wind. The park was deserted, save for a few ambitious joggers. Footsteps approached from behind, nearly silent against the wet concrete. "You're exactly on time," a woman's voice said. Kaylin turned. Josephine Mercer stood 10 feet away. She was dressed in a nondescript black trench coat, her hands buried deep in her pockets. Without the waitress uniform and the severe bun, she looked like a phantom, someone designed to blend into any crowd and disappear. "Josephine," Kaylin said, using her real name deliberately. He wanted her to know he had dismantled her cover. She didn't flinch. "I assume your man Hayes had to burn some serious favors to get past my firewalls so quickly. Impressive." "You used me," Kaylin said, his voice carrying easily over the sound of the crashing waves. "You orchestrated that entire evening. You knew Croft was wearing a wire. You knew he was trying to frame me." "I did," Josephine replied, stepping up to the railing, her eyes fixed on the financial district across the water. "Croft is a parasite. He destroys companies and leaves the working class to take the fall while he hides behind indemnity clauses. He ruined my father. So I decided to ruin him. And you needed a whale to do it," Kaylin noted. "Croft wouldn't have met with anyone less than a billionaire for the Helios deal. You intercepted the SEC's investigation into Croft, realized he was going to use me as a human shield, and you tipped me off so I would gut him instead." Josephine finally turned to look at him, her green eyes piercing and completely devoid of fear. "You took his firm, Kaylin. You took his prize. With that signed affidavit you forced out of him, he's legally exposed to the proxy firm manipulation. I forwarded a copy of your new contract to my old friends at the SEC 3 hours ago. By noon today, federal agents are going to raid Croft Capital. He's going to federal prison for a very, very long time." Kaylin felt a grudging sense of respect. It was a masterstroke of revenge, clean, utterly devastating, and highly illegal. "If you've achieved your goal," Kaylin asked, stepping closer, "why ask me to meet you here? You could have vanished." Josephine's expression hardened. "Because I didn't just bring you here to gloat, Mr. Smith. I brought you here to warn you. You think you won last night. You think you walked away with a $12 billion battery company for a fraction of the cost. I have the patents." "The technology is sound," Kaylin said defensively, his instincts flaring. "The technology is flawless," Josephine agreed, "but the company is rigged to explode, literally." She pulled a small encrypted flash drive from her pocket and held it out. Kaylin didn't take it immediately. He stared at the small piece of metal as if it were a live grenade. "What is this?" he demanded. "Croft wasn't just shorting Helios tech," Josephine explained, her voice dropping to a low, urgent pitch. "He was playing a double blind. He knew he couldn't acquire Helios on his own, so he always intended to frame you into buying it. But the real play wasn't the finder's fee. Croft paid a senior engineer at Helios to sabotage the next public demonstration of their solid-state battery. Next week, when Helios does its live stress test in front of the Department of Energy, the battery is programmed to fail catastrophically. It will cause a massive thermal runaway, a fire." Kaylin's blood ran cold. If a solid-state battery caught fire during a government test, the company's valuation would instantly drop to zero. If I had signed that original contract, Kaylin realized, the horror dawning on him, I would be holding a toxic asset when the fire happened. "Exactly," Josephine said. "And Croft had heavily shorted your company, Smith Holdings, through offshore shell accounts. When the media broke the news that Kaylin Smith had just bought a fraudulent exploding tech company, your stock would tank. Croft would have made billions off your ruin." Kaylin finally reached out and took the flash drive, his fingers grazing hers. The drive felt heavy, loaded with the weight of his entire empire. "This drive contains the identity of the saboteur inside Helios," Josephine said, stepping back into the fog, "and the source code of the malware they planted in the battery's safety regulators. You have 5 days to find the engineer, purge the code, and secure the test. If you don't, Helios burns, and your $4 billion investment burns with it." "Why give this to me?" Kaylin asked, his voice rough. "You got your revenge on Croft. Why save my company?" Josephine offered a sad, fleeting smile. "Because you build things, Kaylin. You're ruthless, but you don't destroy pensions and drive good men to put a gun in their mouths. Consider this a professional courtesy. Clean up your new company, and don't look for me again." She turned and walked into the thick morning mist. Kalin didn't order his men to follow her. He stood alone on the pier, the flash drive clutched tightly in his fist. He had survived the predator at the dinner table, but now he had 5 days to stop a bomb from detonating his legacy. He pulled out his phone and dialed Hayes. "David," Kalin said, his voice laced with pure, unadulterated ice, "assemble the crisis team. We are going to Silicon Valley." The Gulfstream G650 touched down on the tarmac of Moffett Federal Airfield just as the California sun began to burn off the morning marine layer. Kalin Smith did not sleep during the cross-country flight from New York. He spent the 6 hours in the aircraft's stateroom, his eyes locked on the scrolling lines of code displayed on a secure monitor. Beside him, David Hayes was working furiously on a heavy, military-grade Panasonic Toughbook. The encrypted flash drive Josephine Mercer had handed over on the Brooklyn Pier was plugged into an isolated sandbox environment. "It's a polymorphic worm, Kalin," Hayes said, rubbing his eyes. The ex-MI6 officer looked grim. "Brilliant, really. It hides inside the Battery Management System, the BMS. It lays dormant during standard operations. But the moment the battery is subjected to an 80% load stress, exactly the parameter the Department of Energy will test, it overrules the cooling regulators. It creates an artificial feedback loop." "A thermal runaway," Kalin murmured, leaning back in his leather seat. "The battery will literally cook itself from the inside out." "And take a good chunk of the testing facility with it," Hayes confirmed. Croft wasn't just planning a financial short, he was orchestrating industrial terrorism. "The source code Josephine provided gives us the signature, but we need physical access to the Helios mainframe to deploy the patch." 45 minutes later, a convoy of black SUVs pulled up to the glass and steel headquarters of Helios Tech in San Jose. The building was a monument to Silicon Valley optimism, all open-plan workspaces and living green walls. But as Kalin strode through the sliding glass doors, flanked by Hayes and a private security detail, the atmosphere was anything but optimistic. Dr. Gregory Finch, the CEO and founder of Helios, was waiting in the lobby. Finch was a brilliant physicist, but a terrible businessman, the exact reason his company had bled cash and fallen prey to Richard Croft's predatory tactics. He looked pale, his rumpled corduroy jacket hanging loosely on his frame. "Mr. Smith," Finch said, extending a trembling hand, "we received the countersigned acquisition documents from Skadden Arps this morning. I admit I expected Richard Croft to be with you. We were told Croft Capital was structuring the buyout." Kalin ignored the extended hand. He walked straight past Finch toward the secure elevator banks. "Croft Capital is currently being raided by the SEC, Dr. Finch. I am the sole owner of 80% of this company. And right now, your life's work is 48 hours away from becoming a very expensive, very public bomb." Finch scrambled to keep up, scanning his badge to authorize the elevator. "A bomb? I don't understand." "We are going to your server room," Kalin commanded, stepping into the elevator. "And you are going to summon your chief technology officer immediately." The server room was a frigid, humming fortress in the basement of the building. As Hayes plugged his terminal into the mainframe and began compiling Josephine's patch, Finch frantically dialed his phone. "It's going straight to voicemail," Finch stammered, looking at his screen in confusion. "Simon Reed, he's the CTO. He hasn't been in the office for 2 days. He said he was taking personal time to prepare mentally for the Department of Energy presentation." Kalin and Hayes exchanged a dark look. "He's in the wind," Hayes said, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he bypassed Helios's internal firewalls, using the backdoor access codes Josephine had provided. Palantir tracking software shows Reed's passport was flagged at SFO last night. He boarded a red-eye to Dubai. Croft paid him well enough to disappear before the explosion. "My God," Finch whispered, sinking into a swivel chair, his face buried in his hands. "Simon wrote the core architecture for the BMS. If he planted a worm, the Department of Energy test is at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory tomorrow. The Secretary of Energy is flying in. We have to cancel. We have to pull the plug." "If we cancel, the company's valuation hits zero anyway," Kalin said, his voice cold and flat. "The media will assume the technology is fraudulent. Croft's offshore shell companies will still cash in on the short sell, and Helios goes bankrupt. No, we do not cancel." It's too deeply embedded, sir, Hayes interrupted, frustration bleeding into his voice. Reed was smart. He didn't just write the worm, he tethered it to an external server handshake. The worm checks in with a remote IP address every 10 seconds. If I delete the code from the mainframe now, the external server will register the deletion and immediately trigger a failsafe, locking down the battery entirely. We can't purge it here. Kalin stared at the glowing server racks. The predator inside him, the one that refused to lose, calculated the odds. We don't purge it here, Kalin said finally, his eyes locking onto Hayes. We let the battery ship to Lawrence Livermore. We let the test begin. We let the worm activate. Finch shot up from his chair. Are you insane? It will detonate. Only if the external server tells it to keep heating up, Kalin countered, a dangerous smirk forming on his face. Hayes, can you isolate the external handshake protocol? Yes, but... Then we take the fight to the testing chamber, Kalin ordered. We corner the worm when it exposes itself. Croft wanted a show. Let's give him one. The testing chamber at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, specifically the heavily reinforced subterranean bunker of Building 332, was a brutalist cathedral of thick concrete and blast-proof borosilicate glass. Inside the isolation chamber sat the Helios solid-state battery array. It was a sleek metallic cube the size of a commercial refrigerator, currently humming with enough latent kinetic potential to power the entire financial district of San Francisco. Behind the protective glass, the observation deck was suffocatingly tense. High-ranking officials from the Department of Energy, including Secretary Jennifer Granholm herself, stood with their entourages of military liaisons and independent risk assessors from firms like BlackRock and Vanguard. They held encrypted tablets, their eyes locked on the prize. They were searching for the holy grail of renewable energy, the pivot point of the next century's economy, and Helios Tech had promised to deliver it. Kalin Smith stood at the back of the observation deck. He wore a bespoke Tom Ford suit in midnight blue, exuding an aura of absolute, unshakable sovereignty. But beneath the tailored wool and the cold, diamond-hard exterior, his pulse was a steady, rhythmic drumbeat of pure adrenaline. Beside him, at a secondary engineering terminal patched directly into the facility's intranet, sat David Hayes. The ex-MI6 operative was sweating, his eyes darting across lines of executing code. On his other side was Dr. Gregory Finch, the brilliant but fragile founder of Helios, who looked as though he might collapse into a heap of tweed and terror at any moment. As the countdown to the maximum stress test began, Kalin's mind inexplicably drifted away from the multi-billion-dollar asset behind the glass. It drifted to the fog rolling off the East River. It drifted to Josephine Mercer. It wasn't love. Men like Kalin Smith didn't have the capacity for such a fragile, unpredictable liability. But what he felt for the phantom who had orchestrated this entire corporate bloodbath was a dark, intoxicating, gravity-shifting obsession. Josephine possessed a ruthless intellect that mirrored his own, wrapped in a tragic, burning vendetta. She had stepped into his world, danced on the razor's edge of federal prison, and slipped away, leaving behind a lingering scent of rain and gunpowder. She was the only person in 3 decades who had managed to completely outmaneuver him. And the memory of her sharp green eyes looking at him on that pier ignited a dangerous, thrilling spark in his chest. He was fighting this war today not just for his empire, but to honor the lethal gift she had handed him. T-minus 2 minutes to maximum load stress, the facility director announced over the PA system, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. Grid simulation engaging. Through the glass, heavy robotic arms clamped thick, copper-coiled cables onto the battery's output nodes. The hum in the room deepened into a physical vibration, a low-frequency rumble that rattled the teeth in Kalin's jaw. "Status, Hayes," Kalin said quietly, his voice a calm anchor in the rising storm. "Temperatures are nominal. The core is resting at 42 degrees Celsius, Hayes reported, his fingers resting lightly on his keyboard. The battery management system is functioning perfectly. Power output is scaling beautifully. We are at 50% capacity." Kalin knew the tranquility was an illusion. Halfway across the world, in a luxury high-rise in Dubai, Simon Reed, the treacherous CTO bought and paid for by Richard Croft, was likely watching a mirrored telemetry feed. Reed was waiting for the precise mathematical moment to strike the match and burn Kaylin's empire to the ground. Approaching 70% load threshold, the PA system droned. Everything is green, scaling to 80% in 30 seconds. I have the countermeasure queued, Hayes whispered, leaning closer to the screen. The absolute second the worm initiates its external handshake to override the liquid nitrogen cooling regulators, I'll slam the back door shut and upload Josephine's patch. 80% load reached, Secretary Granholm murmured, nodding approvingly as she looked at her tablet. It's holding steady. The voltage is incredible. For 10 agonizing, breathless seconds, nothing happened. The battery hummed. Finch let out a ragged gasp of relief, his shoulders dropping. And then the digital trap snapped shut. Bathed in the sudden violent flashing of red emergency strobes, Hayes's terminal lit up with a cascading waterfall of critical error warnings. The wail of the facility's sirens pierced the air, drowning out the low hum of the battery. Core temperature spiking, Hayes shouted over the deafening noise. 60 degrees, 80 degrees. The cooling regulators just went offline. The BMS is completely locked out. It's the worm, Kaylin said, his eyes narrowing as he stared through the glass. The metallic cube was beginning to emanate a faint, terrifying heat distortion. It's initiating the artificial feedback loop, Hayes yelled, his hands flying across the keyboard in a blur of desperate motion. It's pulling a remote handshake from an IP proxy in the Emirates. Reed is in the system. Deploy the patch, Kaylin ordered, stepping forward. Hayes smashed the enter key. A progress bar appeared on his screen, a tiny digital shield fighting against the malicious code Reed had written. Uploading 20%, 40%. It's not holding, Hayes roared, raw panic bleeding into the hardened spy's voice. Reed built a secondary polymorphic firewall. He's actively fighting me from Dubai. The patch is being rejected. Core temperature is at 130 degrees. What the hell is going on? Secretary Granholm demanded, her security detail immediately stepping in to shield her. If it hits 200 degrees, the solid-state electrolyte will ignite, Finch screamed, pulling at his hair. We'll have a catastrophic thermal breach in less than 45 seconds. It's going to take out the entire observation deck. The facility director was already shouting into his radio, his face pale with terror. Abort the test. Cut the grid connection. I want a full power down now. We can't, a senior DOE technician yelled back from the primary console. The battery's internal relay is fused shut by the malware. It's feeding on its own power loop. It's an unstoppable runaway. Chaos entirely consumed the room. The military liaisons began shoving people toward the reinforced steel emergency exits. Finch had fallen to his knees, watching his life's work transform into a multi-billion-dollar explosive device. Kaylin's mind raced, entering that hyper-focused, frigid state where he made his most lethal decisions. He filtered out the sirens, the screaming, the flashing lights. He looked at the glowing battery, then at Hayes's terminal. The worm was winning the digital war because it had external support. Reed was actively blocking the patch through the network connection. This is a classified air-gapped facility, Finch, Kaylin demanded, grabbing the terrified scientist by the collar and hauling him to his feet. How is he getting the signal in? The telemetry feed, Finch sobbed, pointing a shaking finger toward the main DOE console. We authorized a remote monitoring line for the investors, that thick blue fiber optic cable running from the console into the wall conduit. It connects the testing chamber to the external internet trunk. Kaylin didn't hesitate. He didn't ask for permission from the Secretary of Energy or the facility director. He moved with the sudden, violent, terrifying speed of an apex predator cornered in a cage. He lunged toward the far wall, where a heavy steel-handled emergency fire axe was mounted behind a pane of break glass. Kaylin didn't bother looking for the key. He drove his elbow squarely into the center of the glass, shattering it into 1,000 pieces. He ignored the sharp sting of a laceration across his forearm, gripping the heavy steel handle of the axe and ripping it from its mount. "Mr. Smith, stand down. What are you doing?" a military liaison screamed, reaching for his sidearm. Kaylin ignored him entirely. He crossed the observation deck in 3 massive strides, his eyes locked on the thick blue fiber optic trunk line snake-coiled on the floor. He raised the heavy fire axe high above his head, the muscles in his back pulling taut against the seams of his Tom Ford suit, and brought the heavy steel blade down with devastating bone-jarring force. Sparks showered the concrete floor as the axe cleanly severed the connection, biting deep into the flooring beneath it. Instantly, the external telemetry monitors across the observation deck went completely black. "Hayes, push it now," Kalin roared, his voice echoing like thunder over the dying sirens. "Connection severed. The worm is physically isolated," Hayes yelled, slamming his palm onto his keyboard. Without Simon Reed actively fighting the patch from halfway across the world, the malware was trapped in a closed loop. Pushing the patch manually through the localized intranet. The progress bar on the screen shot forward with lightning speed. 80%, 90%, 100%. Patch successfully deployed. Inside the chamber, the Helios battery was glowing a dull, angry, terrifying red. The ambient temperature display on the DOE technician's screen read 194 degrees, 6 degrees away from a localized, inescapable inferno. For a terrifying second, the room held its collective breath. Then a heavy mechanical metallic clank echoed through the thick borosilicate glass. The cooling regulators, finally freed from the malware's suffocating grip, slammed wide open. A massive surge of liquid nitrogen coolant flooded the battery's external casing. A dense, blinding cloud of white vapor instantly filled the isolation chamber, hissing violently as it met the superheated metal. The shrieking emergency alarms abruptly choked and cut off, leaving behind a ringing, deafening silence. "Temperature dropping," Hayes whispered, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow. 150, 180. The core is completely stabilizing. The artificial feedback loop is broken. Dead silence hung heavy over the observation deck, broken only by the ragged, heavy breathing of the terrified government officials. The white vapor in the testing chamber slowly began to clear through the ventilation system, revealing the metallic cube. It was perfectly intact, its exterior frosted with condensation, humming with a steady, deep, perfectly stable rhythm. Secretary Granholm slowly lowered her hands from where she had shielded her face. She stared at the battery, then slowly turned her gaze to Kalin Smith. He was standing over the severed cable, the fire axe still resting at his feet, blood seeping slowly through the ruined sleeve of his multi-thousand-dollar suit. "Mr. Smith," the secretary said, her voice a fragile mix of absolute awe, confusion, and lingering terror. "What in God's name just happened here?" Kalin casually reached into his pocket, retrieved a silk pocket square, and wrapped it tightly around his bleeding forearm. He looked at the severed cable on the floor, then offered the room a perfectly calibrated, entirely ruthless and charming smile. "Just a minor software glitch, Madam Secretary," Kalin said smoothly, his baritone voice betraying no hint of the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. "My team and I prefer to take a highly proactive, hands-on approach to problem-solving. As you can clearly see, the Helios solid-state battery is completely stable, even under the most extreme, unforeseen stress parameters. I believe we have just definitively proven that this technology is more than ready for the global grid." Kalin turned back to look at the humming battery behind the glass. He had won. The Empire was secure. But as he looked at his reflection in the dark glass, he wasn't thinking about the billions he had just secured. He was thinking about Josephine Mercer, hoping that wherever she was watching the news. 3 months later, Helios Tech went public under the Smith Holdings umbrella. The IPO shattered Wall Street records, instantly cementing the solid-state battery as the foundation of the new global energy grid. Kalin Smith's net worth surged by $14 billion in a single afternoon. Richard Croft never saw a dime. Following the SEC raid triggered by Josephine's anonymously sent affidavit, Croft Capital collapsed. Croft was currently awaiting trial in a federal detention center, facing 30 years for market manipulation, racketeering, and corporate espionage. Simon Reed had been arrested by Interpol in Dubai, his assets frozen. Sitting in his Fifth Avenue penthouse, Kalin poured a glass of 60-year-old Macallan. He raised the crystal tumbler toward the window, looking out over the sprawling, glittering empire of New York City. He had won the war, destroyed his rival, and secured the future of energy. But as he took a sip, he knew none of it would have happened without a phantom in a waitress uniform. Somewhere in the world, Josephine Mercer was out there, balancing the scales. And for the first time in his life, Kalin Smith was glad a debt remained unpaid.